Ooh. Hello, everyone. Week 7 of SEC1337. The most material that there's going to be by far in any of these classes, because this is a doozy. There's like a lot to cover with AppSec, and so I'm going to try to break this out to make it as digestible as possible. So, application security. You know, now at the OSI layer, we've got 7 layers, technically 8, but applications live up here. And applications are the things, there's 3 different really areas that we're going to focus on. You know, let's start with web applications. So web applications are like your banking site, you know, Teams, anything that you access like on a computer with a traditional web browser. You access normally over port 80, you know, at layer 4, which is HTTP. And then for encrypted communication, HTTPS, you operate at 443. And this has kind of been the paradigm for a long time. You know, web applications have existed since really the internet came about. And for the most part, encryption only came about in like the past 5 years. And there's a variety of like different types of attacks against web apps. And if you want to follow more about what's kind of the top 10 of every year, there's this thing called the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP. It's like a volunteer project, and they categorize the top 10 vulnerabilities that affect web applications. And the reason why layer 7 matters so much is because if you compromise this layer, you can also compromise the security of all the layers below it. And this is heavily targeted, but layer 8, the human layer, is still targeted more because obviously as you move further up, you can have a bigger impact and you can sweep, you know, the other layers aside as far as the security. So some of the like more common vulnerabilities you'll see with web apps, this thing called cross-site scripting. You might see it abbreviated as XSS. This is an interesting kind of vulnerability where the client's browser will artificially run code, you know, so an adversary can trick a person into visiting a particular site and have them click a link and run like arbitrary JavaScript. So this can, you know, remotely execute code. This can link the user to phishing pages. It can harvest credentials. It's a common attack. It's in the wild often, and it's typically like in the top 3 kind of common vulnerabilities you'll see, and it's very much a client-side one. And then you have something similar, which is cross-site request forgery and CSRF request forgery. And this essentially abuses the relationship that a client has to an already authenticated service. So the adversary will have you hooked in. You might think that you're making a submission to you know, send a message to the online banking, but in reality, you're actually initiating a wire transfer. And so this is like a blind sort of attack, and it's hard to actually determine that this is happening. The adversary knows based off the impact, but the user usually has no idea that they've, you know, performed actions on behalf of an already authenticated service that they didn't mean to. And then there's server-side request forgery. This is less common, but it's more insidious as far as the impact. Server-side request forgery. This is known as SERF. And this targets, obviously, the server, but the idea here is the adversary can make the server do things it's not intended to do, like accidentally reveal the back-end private networking, like the private addressing, or it can send requests to database services that it shouldn't be able to do from the client side. The client shouldn't be able to initiate the server to be able to do that. And one of the most common examples of this is the AWS EC2, what's called the metadata API. So all of the Elastic Compute instances have metadata, and V1 did not do any sort of check for like authentication. And so you could send a specific request to an instance and pull the IAM credentials directly from the host without any sort of authentication or authorization. So that's a pretty insidious one. There's a bunch more. Like I said, the OWASP top 10 will kind of go into detail, but this is the beginning of like the journey into application security. It's like web apps, all the stuff they're used to on a browser. Then you move into this new realm of mobile apps. And so there are new considerations for mobile apps here, mobile application security. So there is similarly an OWASP top 10, and it's similar but different. So with mobile apps, you have a couple different considerations to make here. One is you have to actually check that the App Store is using signed applications, because there's a lot of times when people inject malicious apps into the Apple Store or the Google Store, and you think you're running a legitimate executable, but it's actually like loaded with malware. And so you have to do this thing called signing, which normally requires like a cryptographic key to prove that the code base legitimately comes from the author that is stated as the actual author. And that's really important because you don't want people to just be running bogus malicious stuff. Then there's also this whole concept of like data and on the device and the persistence of it. So like normally when you look at client side, you're only really dealing with these things called cookies that just store information about your browser, but the authentication for the most part is all handled by the server. However, with your device, you've got additional ways to authenticate, like Face ID, biometric, PIN, and so a lot of the authentication exists on the device, and it makes it more difficult. And so you end up using things like session tokens, which can grant extended periods of time for the device to be authenticated. But you also need to make sure that if, for example, the user's password changes, then the device should also get an indication that you need to re-authenticate with these new means, these additional means of authentication. Otherwise, you could have someone who changes their password and they're still authenticated on their old device, for example. And also, like, how do you handle sensitive data? So device data should be encrypted on the device. So you need to be using like the cryptographic algorithms that are available, on Apple devices, Samsung, and so on. That has to be actually written into the code. And then there's also a third type, which we're going to pivot into, or there's this third sort of consideration for mobile apps, which is application programming interface security. So web apps, mobile apps pretty much rely exclusively off of APIs. It's not like they're hitting the client server model like you do with web apps. They're hitting all the APIs. And so securing the APIs here is really important. And I'm going to talk about that here with the third type. So APIs. I would say probably 80% of like web app attacks now are based around some sort of abuse of APIs. And they're not really focused on because they're new and people don't understand them properly. But an API basically is what allows you to like connect, say, Spotify, with your Facebook login, or, if you want to use Zoom and Google Drive or Google Calendar. It makes it possible to connect all these different disparate services, but at any point along the way, the integration can have weaknesses and vulnerabilities and different sorts of exposure like that. And so, one of the things that you normally run into is unauthenticated endpoints. You might have like this particular endpoint, like API, runtime, something. And normally you require authentication, but it's amazing how many APIs are exposed with no authentication or no sort of authorization. So once you start sending API requests, you can start to then move all about the application. Remember from, I think, lesson 1, authentication is proving you are who you say you are. Authorization is proving that you can say what you're supposed to be able to do. And authentication and authorization are often lacking significantly in APIs just because people don't really think about them. And so that's a really big issue. If you look at Equifax and Cambridge Analytica, this was both the case. Basically, unauthenticated endpoints with no sort of restriction on rate limiting either, like the number of requests that could come in. So Equifax, Cambridge Analytica, which was the big voter database breach, Cambridge Analytica, so on and so forth. this was problematic for sure. And then beyond that, you've also got, I just alluded to it, lack of rate limiting. So if you just allow people to just hammer your APIs and not check like number of requests per second or minute or whatever, you can completely take down your API gateways. And your gateways are just, the systems that kind of route to the particular backend APIs. So that's an availability issue right there. If you can't get to your stuff, that's a security problem. So that's number 2, and this is all OAuth. Again, OAuth top 10 API kind of covers this in depth. Top 10 API. And then the third sort of issue here is, and this is where a lot of the bug bounty programs come in, where you can find all kinds of free stuff if you want to like hammer around with different services. It's this idea of parameter pollution and HTTP smuggling. So what does that mean? It means that you can generally, in API, if you're not doing input sanitation and you're not really checking user parameters, a lot of times the API just spits out data that it's not supposed to. So you see this on a lot of like checkout pages. If you put this parameter, you do question mark paid equals true, or what is it? Service equals complete, like all this basic stuff that you can modify as a request, like in one of these tools, Burp Suite, will normally cause the API to completely freak out and think that you're authenticated, think that you have actually made a legitimate purchase, when in reality, you've just tricked the API into into something, doing something it wasn't supposed to do. So I would say that's probably like the most insidious. This can also lead to like SQL injection, but it's less common now than it is with web applications. But parameter pollution and smuggling is like, if you don't necessarily put the parameter in the URL, but you send it as part of the body in the request, you can also kind of hide various types of types of code that will run when it's sort of read by the API gateway itself. So both of these, they're similar and they're not exactly the same, but they lead to various types of attacks on APIs. Cool. Now, we're going to talk about the big picture of kind of pulling it together, building what's called a DevSecOps pipeline. Let's see. DevSecOps, other than the obvious. Well, DevOps was the union of like, how do we get site reliability engineers to be able to push code, in a way that moves at the velocity in which releases happen. So security had to come in and say, well, we need to also inject security. We can't just bolt it on. We need to actually think about security from the perspective of being secure by default. So whenever the engineers write code, the product managers design security, it should be included in the process, in the design, so that it can scale, it can keep pace as you move further and further down the deployment pipeline. And so this is really important because bolting on doesn't work. So let's talk about starting from left to right, cartwheeling left or shifting left or whatever the cliche is. So you have to start here with developers or even product people, but you start with the developers, you teach them how to code securely. You explain to them why they want to use a particular hashing function over another. You teach them why encryption is important. A lot of times, it's not going to end up costing them more time. It's just going to be a shift in mindset, a shift in understanding. If you get them hooked up with secure code training, like with something like Secure Code Warrior, and you make it so that they have to complete these lessons before they get access to your source code, that can be really helpful. And there's also this idea of like building a security guild or security champions. And the beauty there is like you put security in the hands of the individual business units. So you make them accountable, you make them own it, you make them proud that they've done security well, and you explain to them that as you get further down the pipeline, cost and complexity is magnified with issues. So if you're able to fix the issues early on, they can spend time writing good code rather than just like trying to fix stupid vulnerabilities that are going to end up being extremely expensive as you get down to the right side with the bug bounty and stuff. So start with your developers, and then and there's a lot involved in all of this, but there's also the product sort of people too. So even before developers, like I'm going to talk about this in the next section, but product design. So like, for example, if you have an application and there's a password reset function, good secure product design says person puts in their email, but don't tell them it exists or not, because if you tell them, then they can enumerate all the possible usernames. Just tell them if it exists, we'll send an email. That sort of difference in design makes a big difference, just in the security of the application. Or you've probably seen this, you can only make a password that's 8 to 20 characters, right? You should never limit the size of the password. And when you say the specific number, you actually reveal the hashing algorithm that's used behind the scenes. So if it's 20, that means it's SHA-1. If it's 15, it's MD5. Tells you pretty much that they have crappy security and they're a good target, probably because they have, you can exploit the hell out of them. So don't do that. And then as you move further down, yeah, right. Don't do it. As you move further down the line, you've got a variety of like automated security testing. So, our job with this pipeline is that humans should only really be focused on fixing big issues. Like we should be able to catch and remediate most of these security vulnerabilities early on and through the pipeline. And so when engineers have written their code and they've checked their stuff, and we want to hope they do the right thing, like they look for secrets, they look for OWASP top 10 or all that stuff with their IDE plugins, but they're not going to do everything. We can't just expect them to. So we have to start looking at automated ways to check the security of the code. So one of these things is called software composition analysis, SCA. This is related to the security of your open source components. So like your packages, your libraries, your dependencies, this is all supply chain security. And you should be able to determine what components are in your code pretty much automatically. The remediation can come later, but at some point, you should at least be able to just determine vulnerable components so you can avoid them, obviously. And then secret scanning too. So a lot of times people will commit like passwords, API keys, database credentials, any number of things to the source code. And so you want to be able to scan and remove, and early on, the whole process around intrusion detection versus protection, or detection versus prevention. Yeah, you want to first monitor and then take action. You don't want to immediately just come in and say, we're removing all the Python libraries, all the jQuery, and ripping it out. You got to make sure that you understand how the application works, but also understand how to replace it with more secure alternatives. And similarly with secrets, like there might be a secret in there. Yes, it needs to be replaced, but perhaps there's a lot of dependencies and it's in a bunch of different code repositories. So before you rip it out and kill everything, just detect it. Then you move into specific types. There's this thing of actual security testing, like static. So it's called SAS, static application security testing. You can think of this as taking a book and reading it from end to end. So like before the application's running, is it possible for us to detect OWASP top 10, top 10 vulnerabilities? Is there SQL injection? Is there cross-site request forgery? All the stuff like in just the straight up the code base, when it gets committed to like your code repository, like GitHub and so on and so forth. That's called SAST. And then as you move further down, you get into stuff with your actual build process. So once you're starting to package up your code, you're going to create like an actual environment, like an image, for example. This is the build security. And this image kind of gets packaged as part of what's called a continuous integration and a continuous deployment environment, continuous deployment. And the idea here is this image will be a fully functional version of the application. and it will allow you to run it on any operating system, like the real application. And so this will contain all the components, the environment, the dependencies, the libraries, everything that needs to happen. You need to make sure that the security is solid here. So you need to be checking the images for vulnerabilities. You need to also minimize the permissions that are possible within the build pipeline. So you have these things called runners typically if you're using something like Circle CI or GitLab or something. And the runners are actually the ones that go through the process of building the image and packaging it and pushing it out on the other end. Got to make sure that they don't have more permissions to do things like inject things into these images or just completely run amok. So that's an important part of it. And then you get into dynamic scanning. So once this thing, or actually no, before dynamic scanning, we get into like our Terraform scanning, which is called infrastructure as code. So IAC scanning. We're going to go through and we're going to look at Terraform files and make sure when we deploy this application and everything that's needed to run it, oh, our databases are encrypted, or this application can read data but not write data, or our messaging queue, only has permission to send messages to this particular microservice, or so on and so forth. You can actually read Terraform files explicitly and see if there's vulnerabilities. There's a lot of tools to do this. There's TF-scan, Sneak, like White Source, all these tools that will do end-to-end DevSecOps. And they'll look at these things and they'll look at Terraform files and say, these are problematic, or even like the buckets are exposed, the ports are open, so on and so forth. Then, assuming the infrastructure looks solid, you deploy the application. Further down, you get into dynamic application security testing, DAST. And DAST looks at the running application and it looks at vulnerabilities therein. Like, okay, you can, sort of like the OS top 10, you can authenticate, or like you can keep hammering away at the authentication without rate limiting. The application stores session tokens indefinitely, so you can replay them. It's possible to access parts of the application you're not supposed to using like a service principal that's for another service. I mean, the list goes on. In this, you need both of these. You need DAST and SAST. There's even a new technology called IaaS, Interactive Application Security Testing. I have not yet seen the benefit. I think that's more of like a buzzy snake oil thing, kind of like where AI is heading, just most of it. But DAST and SAST together in conjunction are really important to have a holistic view. And then beyond this, finally, you've done all the scanning, you get to your production sort of side of things. And this is when you've deployed it, your app is like public facing your API or whatever. And, you've done all your checks, you've done your due diligence, but you still want to protect kind of with a wide casted net with something called a web application firewall or a WAF. And this is only going to really prevent common OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities with signatures. I mean, there's not really a lot of good anomaly-based WAFs per se, but it's a good sort of just like wide net to cast. But it's not going to stop people from abusing your code when it's not good code. So this should be something you put in, but just like any kind of next-gen firewall, this is no panacea. And once you've built this whole pipeline, then you've got yourself a DevSecOps pipeline. And that's really the way that you do it. Trying to think if bug bounty's up in here anywhere. No. Yes, bug bounty. Sorry, I'm pivoting here. Yes, okay. So let's go and talk about the true end of this pipeline, which is vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty. Okay. Let's see. So vulnerability disclosure is this kind of idea of companies want hackers and researchers to find issues, that were missed in the DevSecOps pipeline or internally. So it's vulnerability disclosure program. It's normally like based off like your your street cred and not so much about paying out money, which is what a bug bounty is, but it's a good way for like researchers and hackers to get started. So they'll advertise, like Coinbase will say, hey, if you can find a vulnerability in, our blockchain app, then we'll give you this many points, like 1,000 for this particular asset. And then bug bounty could be like, well, we'll give you 10,000. So they're both important, but like I said, it's normally VDP normally comes before bug bounty, just to get people interested in the platform and research when they're first starting out. But when you get more sophisticated, then you get into bug bounty, and you can go to BugCrowd, HackerOne, and you see these public kind of repositories of companies that advertise, here's our applications, our APIs, here's what's in scope, here's based off the severity of what you find, based off of this thing called the CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. There's different factors they take in, like, is the vulnerability, locally or remotely executed? Do you need authenticated access? They have this whole matrix of stuff, but based off of that, these companies will then determine what their payout structure is, and it says exactly on the website. And so there's been some huge payouts. Coinbase had like a 250,000 one, I think last year, related to the way that the issue with their cold storage, moving like coins from hot storage to cold storage, where they could technically bypass the human controls, which would have been bad because they could have sent all kinds of shit off, to wherever they wanted to any wallet. So bug bounties are cool. And like one of the things that I've done for a while that I highly recommend, if you just like want to get exposed or you want to get free stuff, is you find these new companies, like, I don't know, Tom's Shoes, right? I'm just using examples, or Allbirds, or companies that like haven't been around long and aren't on bug bounty programs like HackerOne and BugCrowd, but you care about them as a company. You want to essentially build their program, because what you can essentially do is you can go look, you can start poking around, and normally on their payment page or their shopping page or anything of that nature, that's where you're going to find vulnerabilities based off parameter pollution, like I mentioned, HTTP smuggling, and you can find these vulnerabilities and do the right thing and kind of tell them, like, document it, write up your report, say, here, I found this, I was able to cash out or buy $58,000 worth of shoes or whatever it may be. Here's how you fix it. Also, here's how to create a VDP and bug bounty. Like 99% of the time, they'll be super grateful. They'll try to hire you. They'll try to give you money, or they'll give you just like free stuff. And so like you can like literally go and think about new companies, go to AngelList or Well-Found and look at new companies that started up that you're interested in, like Warby Parker. I mean, you can think of the number of companies in the last 10 years that have launched that probably don't have a good security program, and you can get free shit. There's like 60 or 70 companies that I've been able to help do this for, which has been awesome. So that's bug bounty. And one of the, like, how do you get into it? Well, there's some really cool tools. Well, if you want to learn kind of the tricks of the trade, I highly recommend the Burp Suite Web Security Academy. So Portswigger Web Security Academy. Portswigger makes Burp Suite, which is one of the best manual security testing tools, and they have a whole academy that's free that allows you to go through and learn about OWASP Top 10, web, API, mobile, like gives you example hacking challenges before you can proceed, makes you actually inspect the code and see where you could have issues like SAST and DAST. Totally free. They give you a certificate, and then I think when you finish it, they'll also give you a license to their Burp Suite Pro. Their community edition is included for free, but Burp Suite's dope tool. And then if you want to do like some larger, big automated AI attacks against web apps, there's this new tool from Project Discovery called Nuclei, and Nuclei is like dope. It has all kinds of templates for various types of attacks on web applications in an automated way, and they even have an AI engine that will opportunistically like try different attacks if these ones that they tried didn't work, and so on and so forth, which is really cool. And this kind of all paves the way towards Well, so bug bounty, where's the money at? Like, how do you make money, or what companies are expecting to pay out for without them getting pissed that they're wasting money? It's these things called business logic flaws. So business logic flaws are like, all right, assuming you've done your automated testing, your developers have good security, and we're not finding low-hanging fruit. A business logic flaw, for example, is this thing called broken object level authorization, which, for example, this used to be the case with Amazon or AWS, where you are able to log into an account and you can simply substitute in a different ID for another tenant and it gives you access. So it's an issue with what's called attribute-based security. Because if you're not looking at the attributes of the users, it's an authorization issue. And then similarly, actually BOLA is APIs, and then IDOR, insecure direct object referencing, that's web apps, direct object referencing, but they're the same thing. You know, so there's a lot of vulnerabilities across API, web, and mobile with different names. So yeah, attribute controls. And so these are the ones that pay out because these take time, manual effort. Like the reports that come in involve a very like complex series of steps that, you know, require you to know how the applications work on the front end, the back end, how they connect to microservices. Like that's where the money's at. But there are companies that are pretty silly and they don't fix their basic stuff, and then you can make a bunch of money just from their initial bounty, or like I said, free stuff. Like these companies don't know the first thing about OS top 10, and so you can kind of help create their program for them, which is pretty cool. That's bug bounty VDP. And let's see here, the last bit that we're going to kind of talk about is an idea around threat modeling, or it's this idea of threat modeling. I kind of alluded to it earlier. Threat modeling to create security by default. And threat modeling, AppSec is such a doozy. Love it. But it's totally worth it if you want to focus on one domain that has more rabbit holes than any other. AppSec. So threat modeling for security by default. It's this idea of, we're going to look at, this is really before the engineers even get it. We're going to look at the product with the product people, and we're going to understand every particular part in this application where there's an attack vector. So maybe your web server here, your web app communicates to a database server here, and this communicates to a messaging queue, you know, and then this sends an email, and then this database stores, like, you know, has authentication, has credentials for users, and you kind of look at the entire flow with the product engineers of where data can exist, where vulnerabilities can exist. So, you know, as simple as landing on the page. Are you using HTTP or are you using HTTPS? You're going to threat model. If you're using HTTP, the possibility is that you're not encrypting your data. You could have an issue where between client and server, you know, data is intercepted, it's sent in plain text. So you're threat modeling this, and then you're going to the next area. You're saying, okay, once you're here, do you require a multi-factor? Is it a simple username and password? What's the password reset page look like? Like all these different possible ways in which things can go wrong. And then you figure out, okay, based off of knowing this, how do we make sure that we design this by security by default? Well, it's pretty evident. We use HTTPS. We enforce multi-factor. You know, you kind of go through so that before the engineers even start developing it, this damn thing is already like secure by default. But you also have to ensure this isn't, like Bruce Schneier says, security is a process, not a product. Whenever there's a new feature added, you've got to go back and threat model. It's a continuous thing, because if you miss that process, you could introduce another vulnerability, and then you could have unexpected outcomes. You know, maybe you're not even, maybe you didn't threat model for a new type of Redis queue, for example. Let's say you're going to use Redis to store, you know, short-term session tokens in NoSQL. Well, maybe you didn't really think about what happens after that authentication gets to your database, or maybe you're accidentally storing, your username and password in Redis instead of just the short-term session token. So that little blip can cause an entire breakdown, and your whole threat model changes. The threat surface, the attack surface expands significantly, and you want to be secure by default so that, like I mentioned, you're fixing issues here that are way smaller as opposed to here, where they're huge. And that's why the bug bounty people get paid the big bucks, because normally these problems are pretty complicated, and they have been a result of, even though all the automated security testing and so on has been in place, there's still always going to be issues, because humans write code, and so humans can break code. There's no real perfect security, just various levels of insecurity. I think that's it for AppSec on the high level. Yeah, threat modeling, VDP, 16 pages of notes. Cool. All right, that's it. Any questions? Any comments? Yeah, that was a doozy. Let me think. Yeah.
Threat modeling. What is there like a basic structure for threat modeling?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so check out OWASP Threat Dragon, because really the whole concept, it goes down to data. It's like transit. What is it? Authentication, and then like resources. Like it tries to look at different areas, and so yeah, that tool is like OWASP Threat Dragon. Yeah, that's kind of like the gold standard, like Threat Dragon. So for visual people, actually, this would be probably really cool for you, because this allows you to basically just design the architecture of like how the application works, and then at all the points in which one of these 4 different things can be compromised. Okay, data is stored here, or it's moved here, or authentication, or you're managing other microservices and stuff. Like that's kind of the flow. There isn't really a standard per se. That's the thing that makes it difficult, But Threat Dragon allows you to create kind of a template that you can then apply to like all your other applications, and like bake that into your kind of process and stuff. So yeah, that's like OWASP. They do a lot of cool stuff. I mean, it's all volunteer. It's all, yeah. They're like the truth. They're like OWASP. Thank goodness for them. I mean, without the
I know. Look at all that. Look at all that.
See, you're gonna have
oh yeah,
notes.
nice. Yeah, searchable notes. Heck yeah, kick ass. Good stuff. But yeah, get Burp Suite, get Nuclei, start firing away at these new companies, and make some money.
Let's go.
Cool. All right. Peace. Next week, people security, layer 8. Layer 8 did. All right. Adios.